Hello and welcome to The Shining, Part 5, as we delve deeper into Europe's intellectual revolution. One of the main goals of the study of history is to understand why events occurred as they did. Logically, the Renaissance led into the Northern Renaissance, which led into the Reformation, which led into the Scientific Revolution and the Age of Reason. Now, what you see here is an engraving from the first encyclopedia to include contributions from several sources. Written in French, it stated, "If there is something you know, communicate it. If there is something you don't know, search for it." And to understand the symbolism here, truth, in the top center, is surrounded by light and unveiled by the figures to the right, philosophy and reason. This engraving and the encyclopedia itself represented the vigorous search for truth during that era. And so we ask, how did the Age of Reason change the views of human nature?
Now let's get down to brass tacks here.
The Age of Reason began around the beginning of the 17th century with the development of the scientific method. And reason is essentially when one applies logic, but not the senses, to verify facts. Now, rationalism is the methodology used to discover truth through intellect and deduction. Reason, therefore, is the chief source and test of knowledge. It was during the scientific revolution that rationalism was utilized to discover the physical laws of nature. And this led to an era we call the Enlightenment, where rationalism was used to discover the natural laws of human nature. The person who really laid the foundation for the Enlightenment to begin was an English philosopher named Thomas Hobbes. And in 1651, during the time of the English Civil War, he wrote his seminal work, Leviathan. In this book, Hobbes laid out his doctrine for the foundation of states and legitimate governments. He postulated that people living in a world without government would be in anarchy, a state of nature. In that world, each person would have a right to everything. Sounds cool, but he argued that situation would lead to a war of all against all. In the state of nature, man is relatively selfish and wicked, and life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In other words, not too cool. People would be without security and would fear death. So, in order to avoid this situation, people consent to an unwritten social contract with an absolute ruler to maintain stability and protection. According to Hobbes, this was the only way to establish a civil society. Even if the monarch was incompetent, corrupt, or tyrannical, it was still better than the alternative. People would retain only the right to life, because obviously, if you are dead, you have no rights. Fast forward a few decades, and in 1688 the Glorious Revolution occurred, where a group of English parliamentarians assisted in a Dutch invasion to overthrow their king, James II. William and Mary of Orange ascended to the throne by means of parliamentary consent. But was this legitimate? Enter John Locke, who between 1689 and 1690 wrote the two treatises of government. Locke agreed with Hobbes that a social contract does indeed exist. However, under this social contract, people possess natural laws, including not only the right to life, but also the rights to liberty and property, and rulers must preserve these rights. If these natural laws are broken, in other words, if the ruler is abusive or despotic, people have the right to unseat their ruler because governments receive their sovereignty from the people. In this capacity, Locke justified the Glorious Revolution of England as a reasonable and necessary course of action. Additionally, he put forth the idea of tabula rasa, meaning that at birth we are all equal and our minds are like a blank slate. According to Locke, we are all shaped by our sensory experiences and the environment around us. Now, some historians consider the Enlightenment to have begun at the start of the Age of Reason, but for our investigation, we'll consider the beginning to have begun with Locke in England, but to have primarily taken root soon after in France. And this has a great deal to do with government and geography. First of all, France is in close proximity to England, so recognizing distance decay, ideas originating in England would diffuse more easily there than in areas further away. Furthermore, since France was arguably the most absolutist and least representative of all governments in Europe, it is logical that the people there would emphasize the moral worth of individuals. And one of the first individuals we'll investigate was Baron de Montesquieu, who was a philosophe or lover of wisdom. Philosophers applied science and reason to improve society. In the Spirit of the Laws, written in 1748, He utilized an empirical approach, meaning he tested his hypotheses by observing the natural world. Montesquieu analyzed world governments and determined that democracy was best for small city-states, and that a monarchy was best for large multinational states. According to Montesquieu, Britain was the best system because power was divided equally among three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. Now, he did misunderstand the British system somewhat, since the executive and legislative branches were largely combined in the House of Commons, especially under the Prime Minister. Nonetheless, he emphasized the need for a system of checks and balances to establish a nearly perfect government. Another great philosophe of the era was Denis Diderot, who edited the encyclopedia in the mid-1700s, spanning 28 volumes. Many philosophers and experts in numerous fields contributed articles that were divided into three sections: history, philosophy, and poetry and art. Not only did this encyclopedia contain a great deal of the knowledge of that time, but it also contained articles that criticized the government, the church, taxes, the slave trade, and so on. They emphasized that society should benefit everyone, and not just the privileged few. Now, several monarchies and the church attempted to suppress many of these ideas, but Enlightenment thought still diffused, through the power of the printed word, but also because of salons. Now, this may be what comes to mind when you hear the word salon, but in fact, they were secret meetings held by the intellectual elite throughout France and the rest of Europe during the Enlightenment. They were secret because to criticize the government in the open was extremely dangerous. Well-connected people in society, including women, organized these social gatherings, inviting thinkers, writers, politicians, and so forth. These salons served as cultural hubs, disseminating the ideas of the Enlightenment throughout society. One of the true giants of the Enlightenment was François-Marie Arouet, who went by the pseudonym Voltaire. He produced thousands of literary works, writing against intolerance, injustice, and ignorance, and writing in favor of the freedoms of religion and expression, as well as the separation of church and state. Voltaire's criticisms led him to imprisonment in the Bastille, a famous fortress and prison, on more than one occasion, and he was even once exiled to Britain. His most famous work, Candide, was a satire against the impossible optimism of reason. His personal experience of persecution, coupled with tragic events during his life, including wars and earthquakes, led him to realize there was much wrong in the world. And he arguably delivered the greatest quote regarding the freedom of speech when he stated, "I may disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Around the mid-1700s was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose political philosophy represented an evolution in Enlightenment thought. Now, as you should recall, Thomas Hobbes was one of the first to discuss man in the state of nature, which he contended was warlike and anarchistic. People established an unwritten social contract with an absolute ruler to create order and protect their lives. So, as far as representation, there was none, and the purpose of government was to protect the people from themselves. Fast forward to John Locke, and he contended that people in the state of nature were neither good nor bad, and that the social contract protected their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Although he contended that representation established laws that protected people, monarchies were still preferable. So in 1762, Rousseau wrote arguably his most influential work entitled The Social Contract. Just look at how we've come full circle.
The circle is now complete.
Now, Rousseau stated that people in the state of nature were honest, free, and equal. It was civilization that corrupted people. He said that all men are born free, but everywhere they are in chains. Now, this was true in the case of slavery, but he also did mean this colloquially. He contended that the legitimate government must pass laws that unite the people under the general will, or the will of the people as a whole. And this could only be achieved under popular sovereignty, where the people directly decide the leaders in a representative democracy. So Rousseau differed from most other Enlightenment thinkers who were in favor of enlightened despots, or monarchs who protected the natural rights of their subjects. Nonetheless, it was the Enlightenment, centered in France, that would forever change the view of human nature from being subservient under an absolute ruler to representative governments under popular sovereignty.
That is correct.